All right. Hello, everyone. This is Lecture 3 and Reading 2 for the course Rome, Where Are We? At the John David Ebert School. So we're recording Friday, starting at 2:15. So today we have Scipio at Carthage and Tiberius and Caius Gracchus. So this is important because this is kind of the departure point. I'm going to look forward to discussing the timelines with everyone, what you think about how these things sync up, about how they don't sync up. So there are two important themes among others. One is that this is the establishment of Roman hegemony throughout the Mediterranean world that Polybius, the Greek writer, wrote that at this point he refers to it as the whole world, what he thought of as the world that Rome had established hegemony over. At the end of the Third Punic War, Rome had defeated its main geopolitical rivals. Spengler notes this when the Carthaginians had fallen. And then secondly, and then out of this context, you have the first eruption. As Plutarch says, it's the first eruption of political violence between the Romans themselves since the establishment of the Republic, and that is in the eventual assassination of the Gracchi, the two of Caius Gracchus and Tiberius Gracchus. So the end of the Third Punic War is what Polybius is going over, and I'd like to start this. I thought about this. I am going to go forward with it. I'd like to start with a dirty joke that was not my dirty joke, one that was told by Cato the Elder. Cato the Younger is a very prominent politician, a great rival of Caesar's, and this is it's not a father to son thing. They're just both named Cato. They might be somewhat related. Cato the Elder is the one who famously ended every speech with Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. It didn't need to be destroyed, but that's what he was saying. And so this is really the Rome taking this step, which some said was not necessary to being a hegemon. And of course that is, you could say, the step of Rome going away from being a republic and towards an imperial power, taking this aggressive foreign policy stance that it does not need to take. So in his famous speeches before the Senate, each of which saying Carthage must be destroyed, at the end of one of them, he kind of just casually took out a couple of figs out of the sleeve of his toga. So he's got figs in his hand. And the reason I'm saying this is I don't think a lot of historians have picked up on this one. The Roman humor doesn't always come through. And he said, he held these up and he said, "Oh, well, look at this. Where," and you got to think of what figs look like, and the leaves that go in front of them. So and he said, "Where can you find such figs?" And he's talking about how wealthy Carthage is, how bold Carthage is, how what chutzpah, Carthage would have to rival Rome. "Where can you find figs such as these? Why, not a very long sail south of Sicily." Which is to say, hey, look at those guys. Who are they? Who do they think they are? They need to be taught a lesson. They need to be taken down a peg. So this happened. Scipio Africanus, there were Scipii Africani, all these people have the same name. There was a mistake, actually. So those of you in the discussion, see if you can find the mistake that shows up in the reading. We can talk about this. It's an interesting mistake about people with similar names. Diving right into this, Polybius was what you call a Greek hostage, but not a hostage like a hostage situation that we think of. Polybius was a kind of like a noble prisoner exchange, that if the Romans had been dealing with the Greeks in some conflicts up to this point, and so that what they would say is, well, we're going to have some of our rich people live with you, some of your rich people live with us, and that way we can trust each other. It was a very, very common tradition back then. And so this guy was, he was actually Scipio Africanus' tutor. It's important when you're reading the Polybius, he refers to him in the third person. He talks about Polybius did this, Polybius did that. And he was actually an eyewitness to a lot of this stuff. It's a lot like reading journalism. Although I found it very interesting that he talks about at the launch of this, that he's doing parallel histories. He's kind of apologizing because it does come off as a little bit confusing that he's talking about different areas where things happen. He's not telling a smooth kind of Aristotelian unified narrative. He's jumping around a bit. But I thought that this was perhaps, we can discuss this as well, perhaps he was a prefiguring of Spengler himself. He's fulfilling the role of Spengler by saying, wait a minute, he says in this reading, I am unlike the prior historians. I'm going to be having these parallel histories, and he himself makes analogies. The analogy, we are privileged enough to still be able to read the historical analogies that the Romans made for themselves. So that's interesting when we're looking at the analogies that we are making. It goes to show how analogy is something that's... I don't think the human brain gets away from it. We compare things. We learn by comparing. So, at the start of this, I want to leave enough time to talk about Caius Gracchus within the 30 minutes here. So, the Fall of Carthage, it's at the end of the Third Punic War, and there's something that was very important on page 5 of the reading. There's such pathos with this. This is amazing, and it's very famous. So it starts, at the sight of the city utterly perishing amidst the flames, Scipio burst into tears and stood, long reflecting on the inevitable change which awaits cities, nations, and dynasties. Heavy echo of Spengler. And dynasties one and all, as it does every one of us men. This, he thought, had befallen Ilium, that's Troy, once a powerful city, and once the mighty empires of the Assyrians, Medes, and Persians of Macedonia lately so splendid. And unintentionally or purposely he quoted, the words perhaps escaping him unconsciously. So Polybius says, Polybius is looking at his student. Scipio was his student. He was a teacher. He probably knew him from very young. He's watching the student may say the same words as Homer, maybe even without knowing it. And it's so vivid, this eyewitness account, that the general who is in charge of the destruction of this city is watching the city be destroyed. And he's glad that Rome won, but at the same time he is crying. And he quotes Homer, "The day shall be when holy Troy shall fall, and Priam, lord of spears, and Priam's folk." There's something that's unsaid here, which is very important, and it was unsaid for literary effect, and also because every single Roman knew this. The Romans considered themselves descendants of Aeneas. And the split between the founding of Rome had to do with a betrayal of Carthage with Dido. Without getting too lost in the weeds here, that Aeneas fleeing Troy was the legendary ancestor of the Romans. And so here is a general from these Trojans destroying what should have been a former ally and what was a former ally. Even in before the First Punic War, Carthage was an ally of Rome. And he's troubled by this. And Polybius says, on my asking him boldly, I had been his tutor. What he meant by these words, he did not name Rome distinctly, but he was fearing for her from the sight of the mutability of human affairs, about how nothing is eternal with humans. And then he looked at him a bit further on, and he says, "O Polybius, it is a grand thing, but I know not how. I feel a terror and dread, lest someone should one day give the same order about my own native city." So that's something to lay on your shoulders and to think about, and it does bring to mind something that Alan Watts, once said that, and he said this in the 60s, which vaguely, we can talk about the timelines on this, but during the Cold War, he said, and you could hear people gasp in the audience in the recording as he said this, Alan Watts was talking about the necessity of it, the importance of a rival, or an enemy, however you like to say it. And he said, we need the Soviets. Gasp. And they need us. Because you see, when you obliterate your enemy, you put yourself in a very difficult position. I forget exactly who said it, but it's a very famous quote about Carthage and Rome, and it was said by one of the ancients, one of the Romans at the time. It may have been Cato the Elder, that Carthage was ever the whetstone of Rome's greatness. If you live in a unipolar world, this is when things begin to decay, because you're no longer kept at your best, because you have a rival which keeps you hopefully honest, but definitely on your toes. So this is a decisive shift. And we saw a very similar thing with the United States going to a unipolar world after the Cold War ended. And so he goes on and he talks about all these different things happening. And also he has a sense of geopolitics here. This is very important. He's talking about the fall of Carthage, but he's not talking only about that. He's also talking about these Roman armies in Greece who had gotten tangled up in the conflict. And this is at the same time, in the same years, how Greece was being overrun. Greece became a Roman colony at this time. Here he mentions, oh, by the way, if anyone is not aware, in the Lacedaemonians, page 7, that's Sparta. He's talking about how the Lacedaemonians, aka the Spartans, had been fighting. Greeks were always fighting with each other. And so Greece had become weak by fighting yet another war against the Spartans, and Rome is kind of coming in and mopping up everyone. They have to free slaves and draft slaves into the army. Corinth was utterly despoiled. And this reminds me, thinking about the analogies, it did bring to mind the fall of the Soviet satellites. And this is on page 8 of the reading, that for in times past the Greeks had met with reverses or indeed complete disaster, either from internal dissensions, paging the Peloponnesian Wars there, or from treacherous attacks of despots, but in the present instance. See, this is the crucial distinction. They're not actually being defeated as such, Polybius says. In the present instance, it was from the folly of their leaders and their own unwisdom that they experienced the grievous misfortunes that befell them. It was a collapse of leadership, really. It reminds me somewhat of, say, the fall of Ceausescu, of the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, of solidarity in Poland, of the Red Army receding from Eastern Europe and having something like the EU being built. A bit further on, you have Polybius talk about how he was part of the Roman envoy to, and this reminds one of NATO, perhaps of the European Union, that there was a new constitution. There was a new set of federal law and a framework of Roman-led law, which they had written by this Greek, who then took the various traditions of Greek law, one could say of Greek liberty, and then just kind of fossilized them into place. So, it kind of, this is perhaps a little bit of what Augustus would borrow from later on. When he would ossify the traditions of the Republic. He preserved civil liberties to a great extent. This is proved, but in how you could make satires about Augustus. You could criticize the government. Rome didn't really become totalitarian until after the 3rd century, until the 4th century, and the dominate after Diocletian. Getting distracted there, but you're seeing this is in fact a great moment of what Spengler talks about going from the early city to the late empire. You're seeing it happen in that moment there about the establishment of a constitution top down. Constitution on the point of a sword is what happened with Polybius. And there was horrible destruction of art. Poor Corinth. We're going to see Corinth gets sacked yet again. Corinth is like the shiny object that everybody wants to hit with a hammer. But they were so happy. It's kind of charming. He says a little bit humbly. It's pretty hard to say that people made a statue of yourself and be humble about it, but Polybius pulls it off. The Corinthians were grateful for him for preserving. He attempted to preserve. He led by example. Here he talks about the bad leaderships of the Greeks, and then he was offered in kind of a mafioso type way of, hey, Polybius, you Greek, you can take the spoils of the war too, just like us Romans. Then you're tarred with the same mud as all of us. And what he did is he stood up for his principles and said, no, I'm not taking the spoils of war and selling them. And then there were some people who followed his lead, and then these people were admired by the locals for taking the ethical high road. And this is something you see less and less when we compare this to the kinds of political gamesmanship that we find in the Plutarch, this kind of Greek honor versus Roman calculation. Just like earlier in the Spengler, we talked about Greek soul and Roman intellect. Another way of perhaps seeing it here is having Greek honor and Roman cunning. So we have some Greek honor in Polybius, and we do need to be moving along, as much as it would be wonderful to dwell on the Polybius. There's a distinct shift in writing style as well between the two. I think Polybius is clearer than Plutarch, but Plutarch talks about fun stuff like magic and omens and soothsayers. And he concludes this by saying, this is on page 16, that all of this was to ascertain how and under what kind of, this is the establishment of the Constitution, ascertain how and under what kind of polity almost the whole of the inhabited world came under the single authority of Rome, a fact quite unparalleled in the past. The theme that he ends on, really, is, and he says that the books, this is in book, I believe, 39, the rest of his books really have to deal with just kind of footnotes. But the theme that he ends on is, this is the establishment of Roman hegemony. He was writing this, before the Gracchi were killed. And so he was the tutor, and in some senses the advisor, chief of staff, maybe, whatever, brain trust of Scipio Africanus, of the younger Scipio Africanus. The older Scipio Africanus fought Hannibal. This is the younger one. I think he was his uncle. I'm not up on my Scipii. So we move on then to Tiberius. So Scipio Africanus was the mother, I think I'm getting this correct, you guys can correct me. Scipio Africanus, the younger Scipio Africanus, was the mother of Cornelia. Cornelia then is the mother of, oh no, hold on. No, she's the daughter of the older Scipio, and then her sons go work for Scipio the nephew. Yes, the older Scipio was her father, the one who overthrew Hannibal. So, and she starts her life constantly putting pressure on her two young boys that she says, everyone calls me the daughter of Scipio. You know what they don't call me yet? They don't call me the mother of the Gracchi. And they should. You're the Gracchi. You should be more famous. You should be more famous than my father. What am I doing raising you boys? So she was this is a very, very good, there's a real theme. He's writing about, so strong and formidable is this woman in Roman history that in this biography, this two-part biography, these two very important political figures, towering above them is their mother. And she would interact with, as he says, kings, princes, and potentates. She even contributed to the rhetoric of speeches and laws, as he says. So she was an incredible woman. It does remind you a bit of the kind of puritanical sense that someone like Abigail Adams would have. There's a quick anecdote about when future President John Quincy Adams was returning from being with his father, future President John Adams, coming back from France, that there's a letter that's being sent from Abigail to her son saying, if Europe has corrupted you, I hope the boat you travel on sinks. So this is, it's in that tradition, that kind of tradition of formidable womanhood. I don't think we have something exactly like it here, but so. Oh, there we go. I got to keep the screen awake. He sprinkles all of these omens and signs throughout this, that there were the idea of two snakes, the idea of being scared of the sign of a bird. Everything means something. That he does this to talk about what was motivating people spiritually. And I think that's interesting. It makes me wonder and this is an important question, what in our time is something that's like this? A lot of people gloss over this because they think, oh, that's just stupid Roman superstition. Well, yeah, kind of. But it's also something that they thought was tremendously meaningful. We have those things today. I'm not sure at the moment what they are, but it would be instructive to think what would they be? A historian 1,000 years from now, reading our histories and our popular opinion, what would they consider the silly superstition about, snakes going into a bedchamber? But the story about the snakes in the bedchamber is that the elder Tiberius, who married Cornelia, there was a story about two snakes coming into the bedchamber, and if he killed the female snake, then his wife would die. If he killed the male snake, then he would die. But he had to kill one of them to save somebody's life, or to save his son's lives, and so noble Roman self-sacrifice, he killed the male snake, and so then he got sick and died later. And then this is somewhat to make the point that the Plutarch does write that this is, he could not have chosen a more worthy woman to die for, So that's that. Again, this is what high praise Cornelia gets. That this guy was protecting his wife and protecting his sons, and it's good that he did, because really, elder Tiberius Gracchus, who cares? His wife, she's the important one. So whenever anybody says that, patriarchal this and that, pay attention to Roman women. So Tiberius Gracchus grows up. He talks about temperament. Polybius didn't talk about temperament. Plutarch is a very personal writer. It's about moral education. It's about understanding these people as characters as part of his intent. Tiberius was more calm. Caius Gracchus was more passionate. And so Tiberius Gracchus, Tiberius served in Africa under Scipio, who was, I suppose, was an uncle of some type, or a cousin removed, however you'd say it. And that Tiberius was one of the first to leap over the walls, the first person to leap over the walls at Carthage. And I wrote in my notes, what a profile in courage. Right, that reminds you of the stories of Kennedy, PT 101. Kennedy is pulling the guy along. He injures his back and has back problems for the rest of his life because he was pulling this guy to safety with his coat in his teeth and swimming, doing side stroke swimming. It has a very similar feel to this. And then his younger brother was too young to be involved in the big heroic war, but he was involved in the Numantine War, which was in Spain, also under Scipio. I don't know, Scipio being more like I don't know if these analogies go that much, but being more like an Eisenhower figure. Just someone that really brought the country together, someone that was central to something like that. It doesn't fall with the timelines exactly, but he has that feeling. Importantly, at the end of this, Scipio Africanus dying. Scipio Africanus died under suspicious circumstances. And it's after this happening, and this happens many times in history, when you have an eminence grise leave the scene, whether they go into exile, whether they die, whether they're politically marginalized, whatever, you have no one is any longer on their best behavior. Things escalate, tempers get out of hand. And this is what happened with what led to the murder of Caius. But that's a bit further on. And so here they're talking about Tiberius, it was Tiberius serving in the Numantine Wars, not Caius. Caius was governor of Sardinia. So he describes, it's important, you can see this at the bottom of page 21, talking about Tiberius's conduct in Spain, in Hispania, with that the roles of the leadership had decisively shifted, that Polybius talks about the utter brutality of the Roman generalship, and it's important to look ahead again when we look to Caesar, that they talk about the clemency, the famous and sometimes ironic clemency of Caesar, the idea that if you're governing something which you're going to be ruling over, rather than something which you are conquering, you don't want to burn down the palace that you're going to own. You don't want to destroy Corinth, the beautiful city that should be paying you taxes. But the early Republic, which I suppose you could say early Republic is before the Third Punic War and after the Third Punic War. If you want to pick a dividing line, that's as good as any. You see the Roman leadership being very, very rough around the edges and just killing people. That there's a story in here about how a guy was racked, meaning his limbs. This was a Greek nobleman who died. They did not have to do it this way, but they killed him by tying his limbs probably to horses and having the horses pull him apart. And when he says was racked, that's probably what that means. It's either horses or wheels. A very, very brutal, extremely painful way to die. And here, Tiberius is doing exactly the opposite. He's being diplomatic with the people. Caius Gracchus, same thing. When he was in Sardinia, he was being underfunded by the Senate. It was a cold winter, they said, and there weren't enough clothes for the soldiers. And so he had to go around and kind of ask, he couldn't just seize stuff and requisition things, otherwise he would have started a revolt. And so the part of the talent of Caius Gracchus politically, when he was coming up in his career in Sardinia, is that he would go around and just kind of ask nicely for his soldiers to have clothes and to do so in such a way that wouldn't anger the populace to rebellion. And he did it. And then apparently Tiberius was so diplomatic and so good in his leadership that when he was in Spain, every kind of entreaty, he would sit and eat something in their company. Afterwards, they returned his books. So he would give, he set up a library. This is a place where he's putting down a rebellion. And he's such an educated, civilized person, in great part because of the education of his mother, that he's lending books to the local people, and that he has such a good relationship of trust that they're not stealing the books; they're giving them back to him. So this is a great example, and Polybius, Plutarch is including these stories on purpose to show examples of good leadership. That this is Roman diplomacy probably at its best. It's very important. I know we're coming up to the 30 minutes here, but we really have to touch on this. Starting on page 22, we get to one of the most important and influential things ever in the history of rhetoric, which is the two Romes speech. Anytime you hear a politician talk about this, you can see the line of succession with this, that John Edwards, when he was running for president, talked about two Americas. Barack Obama talked about there's one America. People think there's two America. There's not a black, not a red, not a white, not a red, not a blue, not a black, not a white. Trying to be unifying. If someone is trying to play up the divisions in order to motivate people like John Edwards did, he talks about there are two Americas. There's the wealthy America and the poor America. And Gladstone, I don't think it was Disraeli, I think it was Gladstone, long before, in the late 19th century, talked about there are two Britons, the wealthy Britain and the poor Britain, and this all goes back, probably consciously, to this speech of Tiberius Gracchus talking about how there are two Romes. And he's saying, This is starting on page 24. That the savage beasts in Italy have their own dens. They have their places of rest and refuge, but the men who bear arms and expose their lives for the safety of their country, the veterans, enjoy, in the meantime, nothing more in it but the light and the air, having no houses or settlements of their own, constrained to wander from place to place with their wives and their children. Further on, they were styled the masters of the world, echoing Polybius, but in the meantime had not 1 foot of ground which they could call their own. This is the launch of the Lex Agraria, the agrarian reforms which Tiberius tried to push through. He was killed, and then you have all this legal maneuvering, you have all this excuse making, and we'll get to this in the discussions about how, they beat him with clubs so that they wouldn't shed blood. Going from Greek honor to Roman cunning. And it comes out of a sense of desperation. Why are people like that? Well, sometimes because they're sociopaths, but not always. Sometimes people act sociopathic because they are desperate. And this is very much the type of thing that people were feeling. There's all this political back and forth. And again, there's another type of analogy. We talk about the analogy to the Trojans, and here there was a political analogy that the Romans were making, talking about declaring a consul. There was a consul, not a consul, there was a tribune of the people who was obstructing the Lex Agraria. And Tiberius Gracchus was trying to get rid of him so that these laws could go through. And he was saying that if someone is not defending the people, then he's not a tribune. And if he's not a tribune, he can be kicked out, he can be arrested. Tribunes were supposed to be inviolable. Literally, you cannot touch them. They were so. This sets a very dangerous precedent that Tiberius is using this rhetoric to say, if someone does not do his job for the people of Rome, then all the laws protecting him are meaningless. And this is an undermining of the rule of law. He's undermining the rule of law to get laws through because the Senate was being recalcitrant and was blocking the laws from going through. And this is the start of the kind of political race to the bottom. And I can't help but mention on page 29, this is a good example of Plutarch going over the top. I labeled this with my purple prose mark that when Tiberius was in such haste to go home to run away from these people who were going to kill him, that upon the threshold with such violence he broke the nail of his great toe, insomuch that blood gushed out of his shoes. I wonder what the augury would say about these green parrots flying over as soon as I say that. Like Plutarch saying something. So, and I'm thinking to myself, oh, Plutarch, is that... Do you really think that people are believing you? Or maybe it did happen. Maybe he stubbed his toe so hard that blood gushed out his shoe. There's an artery in his toe. Anyways, so moving along to Caius Gracchus. He was less circumspect than his brother. As we talked about, he was more passionate. He also was less careful with the laws. Tiberius, one way to say it perhaps, is that Tiberius attempted to masterfully shape history, where Caius was swept up in the midst of history. And it was said here that he would have stayed away from politics. Oh, he would have stayed away to politics, but then he has a dream. And in his dream, his brother says to him, "Oh, Caius, why are you waiting? No, go and do and get this done." And apparently he was so moved by this dream that he just had to go and become involved in public life, which, like a tragic Greek figure, eventually was his undoing. And the coda of this, Plutarch is you can criticize him as a historian, but you have to give him praise as a writer. As a writer of prose, the way he wraps up this chapter, this book, I may as well just read this. It's reported that as Cornelia, their mother, bore the loss of her 2 sons, she lived to see both her sons murdered. Her sons in which she invested so much of her life and her effort and her hopes and dreams. Cornelia, their mother, bore the loss of her 2 sons with a noble and undaunted spirit, in reference to the holy places in which they were slain. That's another thing, is that these people were killed. It's like murdering a bishop in a cathedral. These people were killed in a place where you weren't even supposed to carry weapons. And so she retired kind of off to the country, away from the city of Rome, and that throughout her life, there were many strangers at her house. Many Greeks and learned men were continually about her. And nor was there any foreign prince but received gifts from her, so she was wealthy, and presented her again with gifts. But it was most admirable to her to make mention of her sons, without any tears or sign of grief, and give the full account of their deeds and misfortunes, as if she had been relating the history of some ancient heroes. This made some imagine that age or the greatness of her afflictions had made her senseless and devoid of natural feelings, but they who so thought were themselves the more truly insensible. They were the crazy ones, not her, says Plutarch. Not to see how much more a noble nature and education avail to conquer any affliction, and though fortune may often be more successful and may defeat the efforts of virtue to avert misfortunes, it cannot, when we incur them, prevent our hearing them reasonably. So he ends by focusing on this incredible woman who was shaping the history of the Republic by how she encouraged her sons, by how she probably even wrote legislation. And throughout her life, she influenced. And we will see other Roman women like this, some of them more favorable, some of them less favorable, but influential nonetheless. And it is from this point onward that we have the split established between what will become called the optimates, those who wish for the rule of the best, and the populares, those who wish for the benefit of the people. We'll be discussing these themes. Not too shabby, only 7 minutes over on time. We will be discussing these themes in our extended session coming up. Very much looking forward to it. Thank you.